Big Bend National Park had always been one of my favorite places. Its vastness, the raw beauty of the desert and mountains, and the sense of isolation drew me in every time. A few years ago, I planned a short trip to hike some of the trails I hadn't yet explored. Most of the trip had been uneventful, peaceful really. The kind of calm that reminds you why you love hiking in the first place. But what happened on my third day out is something I'll never forget. That morning, I decided to take it easy. The first 2 days had been filled with longer hikes, and my legs were feeling the strain. I figured a short hike to a scenic overlook would be perfect. The window trail seemed like a good choice, a manageable distance with a rewarding view at the end. It's an out-and-back trail, not a loop, so I'd follow the same path to return. The thought of a quiet, simple hike sounded perfect. The day started like any other. I packed some water, a snack, and my small first aid kit. The weather was mild, with a bright sun overhead and a gentle breeze that kept the desert heat at bay. As I set out on the trail, I noticed a few of the warning signs scattered along the way. Reminders that this was wild country, home to mountain lions and black bears. I always read them, even though I'd never encountered anything dangerous before. They were a reminder to stay alert, though, and as I walked, I let my mind wander to the what-ifs. What would I do if a wildcat crossed my path? Would I freeze? Run? Fight? I thought of all the advice I'd read over the years. Make yourself big, make noise, don't run. I pictured myself in the scenarios, going through the motions in my head. It was an idle way to pass the time. After all, what were the chances I'd actually run into something? These were thoughts you entertained for fun, not because you truly expected to need them. The trail was busy enough that I crossed paths with other hikers every so often. Most of them were heading back toward the trailhead, offering me quick nods or a brief, "Hey," as we passed. It felt comforting, knowing there were others out there. But as I got closer to the overlook, the foot traffic thinned out. By the time I reached the end of the trail, I was alone. The overlook was stunning, as promised. The trail ended at a narrow gap in the cliffs, framing the desert below like a natural window. The drop-off was sheer, a vertical plummet that made my stomach churn if I leaned too far forward. I sat for a while, soaking it all in. The view, the silence, the faint rustle of wind through the brush. It was moments like this that made every mile worth it. Eventually, the sun climbed higher, and I knew it was time to head back. The return trip was uneventful at first. I retraced my steps along the trail, the landscape familiar, but no less beautiful. As I walked, I fell into a rhythm, the steady crunch of my boots against the dirt keeping time. I passed a few more hikers heading toward the overlook, exchanging quick greetings, but not much else. It wasn't until I was a little over halfway back that I rounded a bend and saw something that made my heart stop. About 20 yards ahead, standing in the middle of the trail, was a black bear. For a moment, I froze, my brain struggling to catch up with what my eyes were seeing. The bear was small, not much bigger than me, and it was grazing, its head down as it sniffed at the ground. My first thought was ridiculous. He's not that big. If there's trouble, I could take him. The thought flickered for barely a second before the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. Where there's a small bear, there's probably a bigger bear, a mother bear. And just as the thought formed, a cub emerged from the brush, waddling up beside the bear on the trail. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just any bear. It was a mother bear with her cub. My chances of taking anything were now zero. I was in trouble, and I knew it. The bear hadn't noticed me yet. She was still grazing, her head down, oblivious to my presence. I stood frozen, my mind racing. What was I supposed to do? Run? No, that would trigger her chase instincts. Stay still. That didn't seem like a good idea, either. I needed to do something, anything, to avoid surprising her or giving her a reason to see me as a threat. The trail was narrow here, with a steep incline on one side and a gully full of thick brush on the other. There was nowhere to go but forward or back. My only option was to find a way to make her move. My eyes darted around, searching for something I could use. I spotted a couple of rocks near my feet, each about the size of a softball. I bent down slowly, keeping my eyes on the bear, and picked them up. My hands shook as I clutched the rocks, their weight oddly comforting. If the bear charged, they were the closest thing I had to a weapon. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. All right, I thought, let's see if the scaring thing works. I'd read that loud noises could sometimes scare off bears, especially smaller ones. I raised the rocks and started banging them together, the sharp clack echoing through the quiet canyon. At the same time, I yelled, my voice cracking but loud enough to carry. The bear's head shot up. For a moment, she just stared at me, her dark eyes locking onto mine. My heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I kept banging the rocks and yelling, taking a tentative step forward. She didn't move. I took another step, the noise growing louder, more frantic. The cub turned and bolted into the brush, disappearing from view. A moment later, the mother bear followed, her movements surprisingly graceful as she bounded off the trail and into the gully. I stood there, frozen, listening to the rustling of branches as the bears moved deeper into the brush. My hands were still clutching the rocks, my knuckles white. Slowly, the rustling faded, and the silence returned. They were gone. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. My legs felt like jelly, and I had to steady myself against the incline to keep from collapsing. The adrenaline coursing through me left me lightheaded, but I knew I couldn't stay there. The bears might come back, or worse, another one might appear. I needed to keep moving. I walked quickly but cautiously, my eyes scanning the trail and the brush around me. Every shadow, every movement in the distance made my pulse spike. The quiet that had felt peaceful earlier now felt oppressive, every sound amplified in my ears. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, even though I knew the bears were gone. About 10 minutes later, I ran into a group of hikers heading toward the overlook. They looked calm, chatting amongst themselves, oblivious to what I'd just been through. I stopped to warn them about the bears, but before I could say anything, one of them mentioned they'd already reported the sighting to park rangers. Apparently, the hikers I'd passed earlier had seen the bears too. Relief washed over me. At least the rangers would handle it. I nodded, thanked them, and continued on my way, my pace quickening as the trailhead came into view. When I finally reached the parking lot, I sat down on a bench, my hands still trembling. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. I took a deep breath, the cool evening air soothing my nerves. The fear that had gripped me on the trail began to fade, replaced by a profound sense of gratitude. I'd made it out safely, and so had the bears. That hike was supposed to be a simple, relaxing day. Instead, it became one of the most intense experiences of my life. It reminded me of the wildness of places like Big Bend. Their beauty, yes, but also their danger. I'd always respected the wilderness, but after that day, I respected it even more. The wind whipped against my rain jacket as the sky above Philmont Scout Ranch turned a shade of gray, so dark it looked like dusk, even though it was only mid-afternoon. We'd been hiking for hours that day, moving steadily toward the next campsite. Our group of 7, 6 scouts and 1 adult leader, was spread out along the narrow trail, trudging through the rugged terrain of New Mexico's Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The air, which had been stiflingly hot earlier, had taken on a strange electric chill. I was 14, the same age as most of my friends on the trek. This was my first real adventure far from home, a 7-day, 50-mile journey through some of the most challenging terrain I'd ever faced. I was proud of how prepared I'd been. My boots were broken in, my pack was loaded efficiently, and I had all the right gear. I'd even brought extra rain gear, knowing New Mexico's infamous thunderstorms were a daily occurrence. But nothing could have prepared me for the storm that afternoon. It started with a low rumble in the distance, barely noticeable over the sound of our boots crunching against gravel and dirt. I glanced over my shoulder at our adult leader, Mr. Davis, who was at the back of the line. He nodded in acknowledgement of the sound, but didn't say anything. Thunderstorms were common, after all, and we'd already weathered a few during the trip. I figured this one would pass like the others had, a quick downpour, maybe a flash or two of lightning, and then it'd move on. But this storm was different. The air felt alive, charged in a way I'd never experienced before. The thunder grew louder, and the sky grew darker. The wind picked up, pulling at the trees around us, their branches swaying violently. Then came the rain. It didn't start as a drizzle or even a steady shower. It was as if the clouds had opened up all at once, dumping an ocean of water onto the trail. Within seconds, the dirt beneath our feet turned to slippery mud. The rain pounded against my hood, each drop sounding like a drumbeat. The trail became a series of shallow streams, water rushing downhill, carrying pebbles and debris along with it. "Stop!" Mr. Davis shouted, his voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the rain. He moved to the front of the group, motioning for us to gather together. "Lightning!" he yelled, pointing to the sky. A flash illuminated the mountains around us, followed almost immediately by a crack of thunder, so loud it felt like it was splitting the air. My stomach dropped. The storm wasn't just near, it was on top of us. "Lightning position," Mr. Davis commanded, his voice urgent. We all knew what to do. We'd been trained for this. "Spread out. Stay low. Minimize contact with the ground." One by one, we scattered into the clearing beside the trail, each of us finding a spot at least 15 feet from the next person. I dropped my pack and squatted down, balancing on the balls of my feet, my arms wrapped around my knees. The goal was to make yourself as small as possible, reducing the chance of being struck directly or injured by ground currents if lightning hit nearby. The rain was relentless, hammering against my hood and running down my face. My glasses were useless, fogged and streaked with water, so I shoved them into a pocket. I could barely see more than a few feet in front of me. The storm seemed to envelop everything. The sound of the rain, the flashes of lightning, the wind whipping through the trees. It was overwhelming, disorienting. From my position, I could see most of my friends. Jacob to my left, crouched with his back to me, and Sarah a bit further to the right. But Kyle, who had been just ahead of me on the trail, was nowhere in sight. A large tree blocked my view of where I thought he'd gone. I squinted through the rain, trying to catch a glimpse of him, but the storm made it impossible. Then it happened. A blinding flash lit up the clearing, so close it turned the world white for a split second. The crack of thunder that followed was instantaneous and deafening, shaking the ground beneath me. My ears rang, and my heart felt like it stopped. For a moment, everything froze. When I blinked the afterimage away, my eyes darted to where I thought Kyle had been, but I couldn't see him. Panic gripped me. My mind raced with possibilities. Had he been hit? Was he unconscious? Worse, I wanted to call out, to scream his name, but I knew better. Shouting wouldn't help. The rain was too loud, and moving from my position could put me in danger too. I strained to listen, to hear anything over the storm. My pulse thundered in my ears, matching the rhythm of the rain. The seconds dragged on, each one feeling like an eternity. I kept my eyes fixed on the spot where Kyle should have been, willing him to appear, to move, to do anything. Another flash lit up the clearing, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a movement, a shadow shifting behind the tree. Relief flooded me, but it was short-lived. Was it Kyle, or was my mind playing tricks on me? I couldn't tell. Finally, after what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes, the rain began to ease. The deafening roar softened to a steady patter, and the wind died down. The sky, though still dark, seemed less menacing. I stood slowly, my legs stiff and shaky, and looked around. My friends were doing the same, cautiously rising from their positions. "Kyle," Mr. Davis called, his voice cutting through the diminishing storm. No response. My stomach twisted. He couldn't be. No, I wouldn't let myself think it. I scrambled toward the tree, my boots slipping in the mud. As I rounded it, my breath caught. Kyle was there, hunched over but alive, his arms wrapped around his knees, his face pale and wet with rain. He looked up at me, wide-eyed, and I realized he'd been just as scared as I was. "I'm okay," he said hoarsely, barely audible over the rain. Relief hit me like a wave, leaving me dizzy. I reached out, helping him to his feet. Together, we walked back to the group, where the others greeted him with shaky smiles and pats on the back. The rest of the hike that day was subdued. We walked in near silence, the adrenaline from the storm leaving us drained. That night, as we set up camp and tried to dry out our gear, we talked about the experience in hushed tones. None of us could forget the fear of those moments in the clearing, the helplessness we'd felt. For the rest of the trip, every rumble of thunder sent a jolt of anxiety through me. But it also taught me something: the importance of preparation, of staying calm under pressure, and of trusting the people around me. That storm at Philmont was one of the scariest moments of my life, but it also became one of the most unforgettable. Shenandoah National Park was supposed to be the perfect start to our honeymoon. It was September 2019, and my wife and I had planned a week of hiking, exploring, and enjoying the peace and beauty of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. That first evening, after arriving in town, we decided to squeeze in a short hike before sunset. The excitement of being newly married and starting our trip added to the sense of adventure. We drove along Skyline Drive, a winding road cutting through the heart of the park, with the mist hanging thick in the air. The sky was overcast, the kind of gray that turns everything dull and shadowy. It wasn't raining, but the dampness clung to everything, making the air feel heavy. The scenery was beautiful in its own eerie way, the mist blurring the edges of the trees and rolling hills into something out of a dream, or maybe a nightmare. As we neared the trailhead, I spotted someone walking along the side of the road. The figure was alone, moving slowly. Something about him immediately seemed off. He was disheveled, his clothes worn and dirty, his hair unkempt. He had a vacant, almost glassy look on his face, the kind of expression that made it hard to tell what he was thinking, or if he was thinking at all. I made an offhand comment to my wife about how strange he looked, but we didn't think too much of it. After all, people of all kinds visit national parks. Maybe he was just a local or someone out for a long hike. We reached the trailhead, parked the car, and started up the mountain. The hike was supposed to be a quick one, just 1.5 miles up to where the trail intersected the Appalachian Trail, and then back down. The trail was narrow and surrounded by dense forest. With the mist rolling through, visibility was limited to maybe 50 feet ahead. It was quiet too, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind or the sound of our boots crunching against the gravel and dirt. We made good time, reaching the end of the trail in about 40 minutes. At the top, they had stretched out in either direction, disappearing into the mist. My wife stopped to use the bathroom behind some trees while I caught my breath and took in the surroundings. The air was still, the kind of stillness that presses on your ears. Even though I couldn't see far, I could feel the vastness of the landscape around me, the mountains dropping away into valleys hidden by the fog. As we were getting ready to head back down, I noticed movement in the mist. My stomach sank as the figure from earlier came into view, walking toward us. It was the same man we'd passed on the road. He wasn't moving quickly, but there was a purpose to his stride, like he had been following us. As he got closer, I noticed something else. He was holding something in his hand. At first, I thought it might be a hiking pole or some kind of tool, but as he drew nearer, I realized it was a combination hatchet and hammer. He wasn't just carrying it casually, either. It was raised slightly, not in an overtly threatening way, but enough to make me uneasy. My instincts screamed that something wasn't right. He got within a few feet of us, and then spoke. His voice was low and slow, and his words sent a chill down my spine. "Found a set of teeth up here last time," he said, almost casually, as if he were commenting on the weather. My wife and I exchanged a quick, nervous glance. I let out an awkward laugh, the kind you give when you don't know what else to do, and nodded, trying to play it cool. "Huh, that's something," I muttered, my voice shaky. He didn't say anything else, just kept walking past us, disappearing into the fog behind us. The moment he was out of sight, my wife and I started moving down the trail. At first, we walked quickly, trying not to make it obvious that we were panicked. But every nerve in my body was on high alert. The thought of that man, his vacant stare, the hatchet in his hand, and that strange comment about finding teeth, it was too much. After about 100 feet, we couldn't take it anymore. We broke into a run. The trail was steep and rocky, and the mist made it even more treacherous. We stumbled and slid, trying to keep our balance as we moved as quickly as we could. Every few minutes, we'd stop to listen, straining to hear any sound of footsteps behind us. The mist muffled everything, making it impossible to tell if we were alone or if he was following us. My heart was pounding, my breath coming in shallow gasps, but we kept moving. I couldn't shake the image of him from my mind. What was he doing up there? Why had he been following us? And what was with that comment about teeth? It didn't make any sense. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I became. The combination of the mist, the silence, and the growing darkness made everything feel surreal, like we were trapped in some kind of nightmare. We finally reached the trailhead, our car coming into view through the fog. Relief flooded through me, but it was tempered by the lingering fear that he might still be out there, watching us. We jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, catching our breath and trying to process what had just happened. On the drive back to our cabin, we barely spoke. Neither of us wanted to voice what we were both thinking, that we might have narrowly avoided something terrible. The rest of the evening was spent in uneasy silence. Even as we tried to relax, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't safe. The man's face, his empty eyes, and the way he held that hatchet were burned into my memory. A few weeks later, I was scrolling through the news when I came across an article that made my blood run cold. Someone had been arrested in connection with a killing near the area where we had hiked. The details were scarce, but the timeline and location matched up. My mind immediately went to the man we'd encountered on the trail. I couldn't prove it was him, but the thought that it might have been was enough to make my stomach churn. To this day, I think about that hike. The mist, the man, his strange comment, and the fear that gripped me as we ran down the mountain. It all feels like a bad dream. But it wasn't. It was real, and it was a stark reminder of how quickly things can turn from peaceful to terrifying. The wilderness can be unpredictable, not just because of nature, but because of the people you might encounter there. It was early spring, and the trails around Powell River, British Columbia, were practically deserted. The tourist season hadn't begun, and it was a quiet Tuesday, perfect for a peaceful hike. My partner and I were both drawn to the solitude that came with off-season trekking. No crowds, no distractions, just the forest, the trails, and the sound of our boots crunching the earth. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of pine needles and damp earth. The trail wound through dense woods, the sunlight breaking through the canopy in patches, lighting up the moss-covered rocks and ferns. We hadn't seen another soul all day, and I was enjoying the tranquility of it all. Hiking always felt like an escape from the chaos of daily life, a chance to disconnect and ground myself in nature. After a few hours, the unexpected happened. Rounding a bend in the trail, we came across another couple. They were standing by a clearing, looking out at the forest below. The man, older with a strong Argentinian accent, greeted us warmly, a wide smile on his face. The woman, younger and Japanese, stood quietly by his side. They seemed friendly, even charming in an odd way. It was rare to meet other hikers in this area during the off-season, and before I knew it, we were deep in conversation. The man was lively and engaging, the kind of person who could talk about anything. We discussed the environment, travel, philosophy, even capitalism. He had a way of speaking that was almost hypnotic, his voice calm and measured, his words thoughtful. I was captivated. I didn't notice at first that my partner was unusually quiet, standing a little to the side, not joining in the conversation. After about 15 minutes, we reached a point where our paths diverged. As we said our goodbyes, the man invited us to an art show he was hosting that Friday. "You'll love it," he said enthusiastically. "It's something truly unique." I agreed, thinking it could be an interesting way to round out our trip. But then he stopped and asked, "Are you interested in humans traveling to other dimensions?" The question was strange, but I'm open to all kinds of ideas, even the unconventional. "Sure," I replied, more out of curiosity than anything else. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a booklet, a thick stack of photocopied pages held together with staples. "Take this and read it," he said, handing it to me. "If you like what you read, I'll give you more at the show." I thanked him and tucked the booklet into my pack. It seemed harmless, maybe just a quirky piece of philosophy or spiritual musings. As the couple continued down the trail, my partner finally broke her silence. "You shouldn't have taken that," she said, her voice flat but firm. I laughed it off. "Why not? It's just some weird pamphlet." "I didn't like him," she replied. Her tone made it clear she wasn't joking. I shrugged and let it go. We agreed to disagree, and the rest of the hike passed uneventfully. The forest felt a little less serene, though, and I couldn't shake the memory of the man's strange smile or the intensity in his eyes. That evening, back at our Airbnb, we sat around the fire pit, unwinding after the day's hike. The booklet was still in my pack, and curiosity got the better of me. "Let's see what this is all about," I said, pulling it out. My partner looked skeptical, but didn't protest. The first few pages were bizarre, to say the least. The booklet opened with a list of rules for humanity, supposedly written by some kind of alien entity. The language was dense and cryptic, filled with jargon that didn't make much sense. It claimed that humanity's destiny was tied to interdimensional travel and that these aliens were guiding us to enlightenment. The text jumped erratically from one idea to another, blending elements of religion, science fiction, and conspiracy theories into an incoherent mess. I kept reading, my unease growing with every page. The booklet talked about how Christianity, Islam, and Judaism were all correct but incomplete, missing the vital truth about aliens and their role in our existence. It described portal gates to higher dimensions and detailed rituals that groups of people were supposed to perform to open these gates. These rituals, the booklet stated, often required the ultimate sacrifice, which was chillingly vague but unmistakable in its implication. I glanced at my partner, who was watching me with a mixture of concern and "I told you so" on her face. "This is insane," I muttered, flipping to the next section. It got worse. The booklet outlined steps for joining their movement, including opening a bank account in the leader's name and donating all personal assets. It was every cult red flag rolled into one, from financial exploitation to collective suicide pacts. The language was manipulative, designed to prey on the vulnerable, promising salvation and enlightenment in exchange for complete obedience. But the final section was what truly terrified me. It wasn't written for the recipient of the booklet. It was written for the person handing it out. It was an instruction manual for how to recruit new members. It included a list of information the recruiter was supposed to collect from potential recruits: name, age, occupation, home address, and personal interests. My stomach dropped as I realized how much information I had casually shared with the man during our conversation. I had told him where we were staying, what I did for work, even details about our honeymoon plans. I felt sick. My partner didn't say anything, but her expression said it all. She had sensed something was wrong from the start, and now it was glaringly obvious. The thought of attending the art show was out of the question. I didn't even want to keep the booklet in the house. The more I thought about it, the more I hated it, the way it manipulated people, the sinister undertones of its message, and the man who had given it to me. We burned it that night in the fire pit, watching the pages curl and blacken, the flames consuming every word. It felt like the only way to rid ourselves of its presence, to sever any connection to the man and whatever twisted ideology he represented. Even now, years later, I can't forget that encounter. I wonder what would have happened if we had gone to the art show or if I had kept the booklet. The memory of that man, his unsettling charm, and the cultish booklet he handed me still sends a chill down my spine. It was a reminder that even in the most peaceful, beautiful places, danger can lurk in the most unexpected forms. A few years ago, I decided to take a solo hiking trip through the Appalachian Mountains. I'd always loved the outdoors, the quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being completely alone in nature. Hiking solo made me feel free and capable, like I could handle anything. That day, the trail was especially quiet. No other hikers, just the sound of birds, rustling leaves, and my boots crunching on the dirt path. The day started out sunny, and I had no reason to think it would be anything but a normal hike. I had my map, plenty of water, snacks, and a lightweight rain jacket just in case. The plan was to hike out to a specific viewpoint, take in the scenery, and then loop back to my car before sunset. It was a simple trail, and I wasn't worried about anything. Around noon, I stopped to eat lunch at a clearing. The view was incredible, rolling hills stretching into the distance, layered in shades of green and blue. As I sat there, I noticed the sky starting to darken. At first, it didn't seem like a big deal. Storms can roll in fast in the mountains, but they usually pass just as quickly. By the time I finished my sandwich and packed up, the wind had picked up and the first few drops of rain were falling. I put on my rain jacket and decided to head back. That's when the rain really started coming down. Within minutes, it was like someone had turned on a faucet. The trail turned to mud, and water started pooling in places, making it hard to keep my footing. I tried to keep going, but the storm only got worse. Thunder rumbled overhead, and the wind whipped through the trees, making them creak and sway. I knew I needed to find some kind of shelter. The idea of staying on the trail in those conditions didn't seem safe anymore. That's when I saw it, a small cabin, barely visible through the sheets of rain. It was off to the side of the trail, tucked between some trees. The roof looked intact, and it didn't seem completely abandoned, though it was weathered and overgrown. I hesitated for a moment, but another clap of thunder made up my mind. I headed straight for it. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and the smell of damp wood and mildew hit me immediately. The inside was dark, lit only by the faint light filtering through the rain-streaked windows. There wasn't much to the place: a single room with a wooden table, a chair, and what looked like an old, dusty sleeping bag laid out on the floor. At first, I was relieved. It wasn't exactly comfortable, but it was dry, and that was all I needed. I set my pack down on the table and sat in the chair, listening to the rain pounding on the roof. My clothes were soaked despite the rain jacket, and I shivered as I tried to warm up. That's when I noticed the carvings. The walls of the cabin were covered in them, scratched into the wood with something sharp. There were words and symbols, some of them familiar, others completely foreign to me. At first, I thought it was just graffiti left by other hikers. People sometimes carve their names or initials into trees and shelters, right? But as I looked closer, I realized this was different. The words weren't random. They formed sentences, though some of them didn't make much sense. Phrases like "do not trust the watchers" and "the forest sees you" were scrawled over and over in jagged letters. One sentence, carved deep into the wall by the window, caught my attention. "Never stay past dark." A chill ran down my spine. I tried to shake it off. It was probably just someone trying to scare people. That's what I told myself, anyway. But as I sat there, the uneasy feeling grew. The rain wasn't letting up, and the storm showed no signs of passing. The air in the cabin felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me. I decided to stay put for a while, but I couldn't relax. I kept glancing at the carvings, my mind racing with questions. Who had written them? Why? The more I stared, the more the symbols and words seemed to blur together, almost like they were shifting under my gaze. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a soft creak, like a floorboard shifting under weight. My heart jumped, and I turned toward the sound. It had come from the window. At first, I didn't see anything. The glass was fogged up and streaked with rain, making it hard to see outside. But then, as lightning flashed, I saw it, a face, pale and expressionless, staring in at me. I froze. My brain struggled to process what I was seeing. The face didn't move, didn't blink. It just stared. Another flash of lightning, and it was gone. I scrambled to grab my pack, my hands shaking. I didn't care about the rain or the mud or the storm anymore. I just knew I needed to get out of there. I threw open the door and bolted back onto the trail, not even bothering to close it behind me. The rain was blinding, and the trail was slippery, but I didn't stop running. Every now and then, I glanced back, half expecting to see that face behind me. Thankfully, I didn't. Eventually, the storm began to let up, and I reached a more familiar section of the trail. The fear started to fade, replaced by exhaustion. When I finally made it back to my car, I was soaked, covered in mud, and completely drained. I sat there for a long time, staring at the trailhead and trying to make sense of what had happened. Part of me wanted to believe it was all in my head, that the carvings, the face, and the noise were just my imagination running wild in the storm. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with that cabin, something I wasn't supposed to see. I never reported it, never told anyone except close friends. Even now, years later, I still think about that day. I haven't been back to that part of the Appalachian Mountains, and I don't plan to. Some places, I think, are better left unexplored. A few years ago, I went on a solo hiking trip to Big Bend National Park in Texas. It was something I'd wanted to do for years. There's just something about being out in the desert, surrounded by open skies, rugged mountains, and endless silence. That feels like freedom. I had planned the trip for months, choosing trails I thought would challenge me but still be manageable. The first few days went smoothly. The weather was clear, and the trails were quiet. Big Bend isn't the kind of place where you run into a lot of people, especially during the off-season. I liked that. I wasn't looking for crowds. I was looking for solitude. By the third day, I decided to take a shorter hike. I'd already done a few long trails, so I figured I'd take it easy with something more relaxed. The window trail caught my eye, a straightforward out-and-back route that ended at a cliffside overlook. The photos I'd seen online showed an incredible view, and I was excited to see it in person. I started late in the morning, wanting to avoid the chill of the early hours. The trail was peaceful, with birds chirping and the occasional lizard darting across the path. The rocky walls on either side of the trail felt imposing, almost protective, like they were guarding a secret. As I made my way toward the overlook, I passed a few other hikers. We exchanged quick nods and hellos, but that was about it. Everyone seemed focused on their own experience, which suited me fine. The trail grew narrower as I got closer to the end. On one side, there was a steep incline covered in scrubby bushes and jagged rocks. On the other side, the land sloped down into a dry gully, its bottom hidden by thick brush. The path itself was only wide enough for one person in some places, with just enough room to feel safe, but not enough to get comfortable. When I finally reached the overlook, it took my breath away. The cliffs dropped off sharply, revealing a sweeping view of the desert below. The sky seemed endless, a deep blue that stretched on forever. I stood there for a while, soaking it in, letting the silence wash over me. After about 20 minutes, I decided to head back. The sun was higher now, and I wanted to get back to my car before it got too hot. The trail felt different on the way back. The narrow sections seemed even tighter, and the incline on one side felt steeper. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I felt a subtle sense of unease. I rounded a bend in the trail, and that's when I saw it. About 20 yards ahead, standing right in the middle of the path, was a black bear. For a moment, I froze. My heart was racing, and my brain was struggling to process what I was seeing. Black bears aren't uncommon in Big Bend, but this was the first time I'd ever encountered one in the wild. It wasn't huge, but it wasn't small either, probably a juvenile, but still big enough to be dangerous. I stood there, trying to remember everything I'd read about bear safety. Don't run. Don't turn your back. Make yourself look big. Make noise. But before I could do anything, a second bear appeared, a cub, smaller and lighter colored, trailing behind the first. My stomach dropped. This wasn't just any bear. It was a mother bear. I knew enough to understand how dangerous this situation was. Mother bears are fiercely protective of their cubs, and any perceived threat can set them off. I was too close, and the trail was too narrow. There was nowhere for me to go. The mother bear sniffed the air, her head swiveling in my direction. She didn't charge, but she didn't move off the trail either. She was grazing, her cub wandering nearby. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I needed to do something, but what? Running was out of the question. Climbing was impossible. The incline on one side was too steep, and the gully on the other side was too dense with brush. I had no choice but to stand my ground. Slowly, I reached down and picked up 2 rocks, each about the size of a softball. They were rough and heavy, the kind of rocks that would hurt if they hit anything. I wasn't planning to throw them unless I absolutely had to, but I figured it was better to have something in my hands than nothing. I took a deep breath and started making noise. I clanged the rocks together, shouting and stomping my feet. My voice echoed off the rocky walls of the trail, a jarring contrast to the silence that had surrounded me moments ago. The mother bear stopped grazing and looked up, her dark eyes locking onto me. For a terrifying moment, she didn't move. I kept banging the rocks, my voice growing louder and more desperate. Finally, she let out a low grunt and started moving. She nudged her cub toward the brush, and together they disappeared into the dense greenery. I stood there, frozen, waiting to see if they would come back. My hands were shaking so badly that the rocks nearly slipped from my grip. When I was sure they were gone, I started moving again, walking as quickly and quietly as I could down the trail. My heart was still racing, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that the bears were watching me, hidden somewhere in the brush. About 10 minutes later, I ran into a group of hikers heading in the opposite direction. I stopped them and told them about the bears, warning them to be careful. They thanked me and decided to turn back, not wanting to risk an encounter themselves. When I finally made it back to the trailhead, I saw a park ranger talking to another group of hikers. I approached him and reported the bear sighting, explaining where I'd seen them and what had happened. He nodded and thanked me, saying that other hikers had already reported the same bears earlier in the day. As I sat in my car, catching my breath and trying to calm down, I couldn't help but replay the encounter in my mind. It was a reminder of how wild and unpredictable nature can be, even in a place as beautiful as Big Bend. I still go hiking, but I'm more cautious now. I carry bear spray, and I make sure to read up on wildlife in the area before setting out. That day on the window trail was one of the scariest experiences of my life, but it also taught me to respect the wilderness and the creatures that call it home. I'll never forget the feeling of standing on that narrow trail, face to face with a mother bear, knowing that one wrong move could mean disaster. It's a memory that stays with me, a constant reminder that nature is not something to be taken lightly. It was the summer of 2019, and my wife and I had just arrived in Shenandoah National Park for our honeymoon. The park's rolling hills and dense forests were the perfect getaway after months of wedding planning and stress. We wanted to start our trip with a hike, something short and manageable to ease into the adventure. We decided on a trail off Skyline Drive, a famous road that winds through the heart of the park. It was early evening, about 6 p.m., and the mist was heavy, blanketing the road and trees in a gray, damp haze. The sun was hidden behind thick clouds, and the light was fading fast. As we drove toward the trailhead, the atmosphere felt almost eerie. The mist muffled all sounds, and the road seemed deserted. That's when we saw him, a man walking along the side of the road, heading in the same direction as us. He was odd-looking, to say the least. His clothes were unkempt and wrinkled, and he carried himself with an air of vacancy, like he wasn't entirely present. His eyes didn't meet ours as we passed him, but something about him gave me a strange feeling. "Did you see that guy?" I asked my wife. "Yeah," she replied, her voice uneasy. "He seemed off." We didn't dwell on it. People come to places like this for all sorts of reasons, and it wasn't our business to judge. We reached the trailhead a few minutes later, parked the car, and started our hike. The trail was beautiful, winding gently upward through the forest. The mist gave everything a surreal quality, softening the edges of the trees and muting the colors of the leaves. It felt like we were walking through another world. We hiked for about 1.5 miles, enjoying the quiet and the cool air. At the top of the trail, we stopped to rest where it intersected with the Appalachian Trail. My wife wandered off to find a spot to pee, and I took the chance to catch my breath and drink some water. That's when I saw him again. Out of the mist, the same man we'd seen earlier appeared on the trail. He was walking toward me, his pace slow and deliberate. My stomach tightened as I recognized his unkempt appearance and vacant expression. At first, I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was just another hiker who happened to take the same trail. But then I noticed something in his hand, a multi-tool with a hatchet on one end. He wasn't just carrying it. He was holding it in a way that seemed deliberate, almost like a weapon. He walked closer, and I could feel my pulse quicken. My wife was still off in the trees, and I suddenly felt very vulnerable standing there alone. As he passed me, he muttered something. His voice was low, almost a growl, but I caught the words. "Last time I was up here, I found a set of teeth." I didn't know how to respond. My brain was scrambling to make sense of what he'd just said. Teeth. What did that mean? Was he joking? I forced out a nervous laugh and nodded, not wanting to provoke him. The man continued down the trail, disappearing into the mist as quickly as he'd appeared. My wife returned a moment later, and I quickly told her what had happened. Her face went pale. "We need to leave," she said. I didn't argue. We started back down the trail, moving as quickly as we could without breaking into a run. The mist felt heavier now, wrapping around us like a damp shroud. Every sound seemed amplified, the crunch of our boots on the gravel, the rustling of leaves in the breeze. We kept glancing back over our shoulders, expecting to see him following us. The trail was quiet, but the silence felt oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. After about 100 yards, we couldn't take it anymore. We broke into a jog, our packs bouncing against our backs. The path was uneven, and I stumbled more than once, but we didn't stop. The fear in my wife's eyes pushed me forward, and the adrenaline in my veins drowned out everything else. We paused briefly at a bend in the trail, pressing ourselves against the trees to catch our breath. The mist was so thick that we couldn't see more than a few feet ahead or behind. We listened, straining to hear any sign of movement. Nothing. "Do you think he's gone?" my wife whispered. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. We started moving again, slower this time, trying to stay quiet. The air was heavy with moisture, and my clothes were sticking to my skin. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Finally, we reached the trailhead. Our car was parked where we'd left it, the sight of it filling me with a wave of relief. We climbed in, locked the doors, and sat there for a moment, catching our breath. As I started the engine, I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the man standing at the edge of the parking lot. But there was nothing there, just the mist and the empty trail. We drove back to our cabin in silence, both of us too shaken to talk. That night, we couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made us jump. A few weeks later, I came across a news article about a man who had been arrested in connection with a murder near Shenandoah National Park. The details were sparse, but the timing and location were eerily close to where we'd been. I don't know if it was the same man we saw that day, and I don't want to know. But the memory of his vacant eyes and the way he held that hatchet will stay with me forever. That hike was supposed to be the start of a relaxing honeymoon, a chance to connect with nature and each other. Instead, it became a chilling reminder of how quickly things can turn from peaceful to terrifying. Now, whenever we go hiking, I carry a whistle, a flashlight, and a knife. My wife and I stick close to well-traveled trails, and we always let someone know where we're going. Nature can be beautiful, but it can also be unpredictable, and so can the people you meet out there. It was late spring when my partner and I decided to take a short vacation in Powell River, British Columbia. The idea was simple: unplug from the chaos of life and lose ourselves in nature. Powell River, nestled between dense forests and glimmering waters, was the perfect spot for it. We stayed at a quiet Airbnb surrounded by tall trees, and every morning, the air smelled of pine and fresh earth. It was tranquil and still, the kind of place that makes you forget the world exists. Neither of us was an experienced hiker, but we loved the idea of exploring trails without the buzz of other tourists. The season hadn't fully started, and it was a Tuesday, so we figured the trails would be empty. We set out late in the morning, our backpacks light but packed with the basics: water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. For hours, we hiked in peace. The forest was serene, the only sounds being the crunch of our boots on the dirt path and the occasional bird call. It felt like we were the only people for miles, a world away from city noise. But then, as the trail curved around a clearing, we saw them. A couple was walking toward us from the opposite direction. The man was older, maybe in his 60s, with tanned skin and sharp features. He had an accent I later recognized as Argentinian. The woman was slightly younger, possibly in her 50s, with Japanese features and a gentle demeanor. They seemed friendly enough. The man greeted us with a wide smile, his dark eyes sparkling with energy. The woman followed closely behind him, her expression serene but unreadable. We stopped and exchanged pleasantries, and before I knew it, the man and I were deep in conversation. He had a way of speaking that was engaging, his words flowing smoothly as he talked about everything from the environment to travel and philosophy. My partner stood quietly beside me, barely saying a word. I didn't notice at the time. I was too engrossed in the conversation. The man was charismatic, the kind of person who could hold your attention with ease. After about 20 minutes, it was time to part ways. Their path diverged from ours, and we exchanged goodbyes. Just before they left, the man turned back and invited us to an art show he was hosting on Friday. He spoke about it with such enthusiasm that I immediately agreed to go. Then he paused and looked at me. "I want to give you something," he said, reaching into his backpack. He pulled out a small booklet, photocopied and stapled together. Its cover was plain, with no title or illustrations, just a dull gray piece of paper. "Are you interested in humans traveling to other dimensions?" he asked, his voice serious. I was caught off guard, but I nodded. I've always been open to strange ideas, and the concept intrigued me. "Take this and read it," he said, handing me the booklet. "If you like what you read, I'll give you more at the art show." I thanked him, and the couple walked away, disappearing down the trail. As soon as they were out of sight, my partner turned to me. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide with unease. "You shouldn't have taken that," she said. "Why not?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I don't like him," she replied. Something about him felt wrong. I shrugged it off. The man seemed odd, sure, but I didn't think there was anything sinister about him. I stuffed the booklet into my bag, and we continued our hike. We didn't see another soul for the rest of the day. By the time we returned to the Airbnb, the sun was setting, and the forest was bathed in a warm golden glow. After dinner, we sat around the fire pit, the booklet forgotten in my bag. The next evening, with the art show looming closer, I remembered the booklet. I pulled it out, curious to see what the man had given me. My partner hesitated, but eventually sat beside me as I opened it. The first few pages were strange, to say the least. The booklet was written as a set of rules, over 100 of them, supposedly dictated by some kind of alien or higher dimensional being. The language was formal and filled with jargon, making it hard to follow. It started with ideas about spirituality and humanity's role in the universe, but as I read further, the content became darker and more unsettling. It claimed that humans needed to make sacrifices to open portals to higher dimensions. It encouraged group rituals, collective sacrifices, and complete submission to a mysterious leader. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read passages about the ultimate sacrifice. It described how groups of people could achieve transcendence by offering their lives to the cause. It wasn't just abstract philosophy. It was detailed, like an instruction manual for a cult. The further I read, the more horrified I became. The booklet wasn't just bizarre, it was dangerous. Then, on the final page, I found something that made my stomach sink. It wasn't addressed to me or any potential recruit. It was written for the person distributing the booklet. The page contained a list of information the distributor was supposed to collect from anyone who received the booklet. My name, my age, my occupation, where I lived, all things I had casually shared with the man during our friendly chat on the trail. I dropped the booklet like it had burned me. My partner was staring at me, her face pale and her hands trembling. "I told you," she whispered. "I told you not to take it." That night, neither of us could sleep. The idea that the man now had personal information about me was terrifying. I kept replaying our conversation in my head, wondering if I'd revealed too much. The next morning, we burned the booklet in the fire pit. Watching the flames consume the paper brought a small sense of relief, but it didn't erase the fear that had taken root in my mind. We didn't go to the art show. Instead, we spent the next few days avoiding secluded trails and sticking to well-populated areas. Every time we passed another hiker, I felt a twinge of paranoia, wondering if they were connected to the couple. When we finally left Powell River, I felt a wave of relief. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that encounter. Looking back, I realize how naive I was to trust a stranger so easily. The man's charm had blinded me to the warning signs, and my curiosity had put both my partner and me in a potentially dangerous situation. Now, whenever I go hiking, I'm more cautious. I don't engage with strangers beyond a polite greeting, and I never share personal information. Nature is a place of beauty and peace, but it's also unpredictable. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't the wild animals or the rugged terrain. It's the people you meet along the way. It was early fall when my friends and I decided to take a weekend trip to a remote hiking trail deep in the woods of the Pacific Northwest. We had been planning it for months, wanting to escape the noise of the city and spend a few days hiking in one of the most beautiful parts of the country. The air was crisp, the trees were starting to change color, and we were ready to disconnect from the world for a while. We arrived at the trailhead on a Friday afternoon, eager to begin our hike. The parking lot was nearly empty, with just a few cars parked around, and we were excited by the thought of having the entire trail to ourselves. We had a rough map of the trail, and though none of us were experienced hikers, we figured we could handle it. We packed our gear into our backpacks, making sure we had everything we might need: water, snacks, a small first aid kit, and a compass. The trail itself was peaceful, winding its way through thick trees and up gentle slopes. As we walked, the only sounds were the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional chirp of birds or rustle of small animals in the brush. It felt like we were alone in the world, surrounded by nothing but nature. We talked and joked with one another, enjoying the simplicity of the hike. After a couple of hours, we reached a small clearing where we decided to set up camp for the night. It was a beautiful spot, with a small stream nearby and the trees forming a natural shelter around us. We pitched our tents, gathered some firewood, and started a campfire. The sun was setting, casting an orange glow across the sky, and we spent the evening cooking dinner and talking around the fire. As the night grew darker, the forest around us became quiet. The wind picked up, causing the trees to sway gently, but the eerie stillness of the woods made me feel like we were being watched. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself it was just the quiet of the forest getting to me, but I couldn't ignore the unease that settled in my chest. We stayed up late, telling stories and laughing, but eventually, the fatigue of the day caught up with us, and we all retreated to our tents to sleep. The night was calm at first, but around 2 a.m., I woke up to a strange sound. It was a low, steady thumping, like something heavy was being dragged through the underbrush. At first, I thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, but the sound didn't seem quite right. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. My heart began to race, and I held my breath, trying to listen more carefully. The sound came closer, and I could hear the faint crunching of leaves beneath heavy footsteps. I glanced over at my friends' tents, and I could see that they were still asleep. I felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. I didn't want to wake them yet, not knowing what this noise could be, so I stayed quiet, hoping whatever it was would pass. But the sound didn't stop. It grew louder, closer. It was coming from the edge of the clearing, and it felt like it was right outside our tents. I slowly unzipped my tent, trying to be as quiet as possible, and peered out into the darkness. The moon was barely visible through the trees, and the forest was a maze of shadows. I strained my eyes, trying to make out any shapes, but I saw nothing. Still, the sound of footsteps continued, faint but unmistakable. Whoever, or whatever, was out there was walking around our campsite, moving slowly, methodically, as if they were looking for something. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. I reached for my phone to check the time. 3 a.m. The forest felt more alive than it had earlier, and the wind seemed to pick up again, causing the trees to groan and creak. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, just beyond my sight. Suddenly, there was a rustling from the woods, followed by a loud snap of a twig. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The sound was too loud, too close. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or a person, but it sent a surge of fear through me. I slowly unzipped my tent more and leaned out, trying to peer through the dark. That's when I saw him. A figure was standing just outside the circle of light cast by our campfire. He was tall, wearing a thick coat, and his face was partially obscured by a hood. I couldn't see much of him, but I could feel the weight of his presence. He wasn't moving, just standing there, staring into the camp. My heart raced, and I quickly zipped my tent shut again, holding my breath. My mind was racing. Who was that? What was he doing here? The woods were deserted. There shouldn't have been anyone else around. We had been alone for hours, and the trailhead had been empty when we arrived. I glanced over at my friends' tents again, my thoughts frantic. Should I wake them? What should I do? I couldn't shake the feeling that this person wasn't lost or just passing by. There was something about his stillness, the way he just stood there, that made my skin crawl. The sound of footsteps started again, slower this time, as if the man was circling our campsite. I lay in my tent, listening to the muffled steps, feeling the terror well up inside me. It wasn't just the footsteps that frightened me. It was the silence in between them. It was as if he was waiting for something, waiting for us to make a move. I waited for what felt like hours, barely daring to breathe, too afraid to even look outside again. Finally, the footsteps stopped, and the eerie silence returned. I waited, listening intently for any sign of movement. Nothing. The man had disappeared. I didn't know what to do. It didn't feel safe to stay out there any longer, but I didn't want to alarm my friends either. I decided to wait until morning, hoping that by then, whatever had been out there would be gone. But as I lay there, unable to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, watching us from the darkness. The first light of dawn broke through the trees, and with it, I felt a slight sense of relief. The woods no longer felt as oppressive, but I still couldn't shake the fear. I waited until my friends started stirring, and then I told them what had happened. They were immediately concerned, but they hadn't heard anything during the night. They thought I had just imagined it, but I knew what I had seen. I knew someone, or something, had been out there. We packed up our campsite quickly, eager to leave the area, and made our way back down the trail. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We passed through the dense forest, our footsteps echoing in the silence. Every shadow seemed to hide something. Every rustle in the trees seemed to hold a secret. When we finally reached the trailhead, we found the car and left without looking back. I didn't want to stay in those woods a minute longer. The figure in the woods had haunted me ever since. I don't know who he was or why he was out there, but I couldn't help but feel that something was off. That man wasn't lost. He was watching us, waiting for something. Maybe it was just my overactive imagination, but the terror I felt that night is something I'll never forget. The woods were supposed to be a place of peace, but now, every time I go hiking, I can't shake the thought that someone might be out there, watching from the shadows. I had always been someone who loved the peace of the wilderness. The rustling of leaves in the wind, the trickle of streams cutting through thick forests, and the sheer isolation of a good hiking trail all felt like an escape from the chaos of everyday life. So when I decided to take a solo trip up into the mountains for a long weekend, I was excited. I had spent months planning, researching the trail, and preparing all my gear. The plan was simple: 2 days, 1 night, and a hike through some of the most remote parts of the forest in the Appalachian Mountains. I thought it was just what I needed. The trail I had chosen was known for its beauty and serenity, a quiet, almost untouched path that led up to a secluded waterfall. It wasn't a widely known spot, so I figured I'd have it all to myself. I parked my car at the trailhead around mid-morning, feeling energized and ready for the adventure. The day was perfect: clear skies, a slight breeze, and the sun shining just enough to keep me warm. I had my backpack with all the necessities: water, a map, a compass, a first aid kit, and my camera for a few photos. It was going to be an unforgettable hike, I thought. The first part of the trail was easy. The path was well marked, and I found myself enjoying the quiet of the forest. I passed a few other hikers, but they were going in the opposite direction, heading back to the trailhead. Soon, I was completely alone, the sound of my footsteps the only noise in the stillness of the trees. The forest was beautiful, and it made me feel small in a comforting way. As I continued on, the trail began to narrow and wind through the trees more tightly. The occasional rock outcropping and scattered fallen logs added to the challenge. But it wasn't difficult. The air was crisp and refreshing, and the scent of pine and earth filled my senses. Around midday, I reached a small clearing near a stream. It was the perfect spot to rest and have a snack. I sat down on a large rock and pulled out some granola bars, enjoying the peaceful surroundings. The only sound was the gentle gurgle of the stream, and the sun was warm on my face. I closed my eyes for a moment, just taking it all in, when I suddenly heard a rustling in the brush nearby. I froze, my heart rate picking up slightly. It was a common sound in the woods, maybe a deer or a small animal. But there was something different about this sound. It was too loud for a deer, too deliberate. It wasn't a random rustle from the wind or animals moving through the leaves. It was a movement, one that was almost too coordinated. I glanced up, scanning the forest. The trees around me were dense, but I could still see through the gaps. Nothing, just shadows and branches swaying in the breeze. I felt a chill down my spine but shook it off. Probably just a bird, I thought. Or maybe a squirrel, something small. I tried to relax and go back to eating, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. I decided to pack up and keep moving, hoping the feeling would fade as I got farther into the hike. The trail continued upwards, and the forest seemed to get even denser. The sunlight struggled to break through the canopy, casting the path in a quiet, shadowy gloom. The deeper I went, the less I could hear. No birds, no squirrels, no animals at all. Just the sound of my own footsteps, and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind picked up. The further I walked, the quieter it became. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The wind stopped altogether. The only sound now was the steady crunch of my boots on the earth and the occasional sound of my breath. The sense of unease that had started back at the stream had grown into something else, something darker, something that felt wrong. I tried to push it aside, focusing on the beauty around me. The trees were tall and ancient, their trunks thick with age. The smell of damp earth and moss filled my nostrils, but it wasn't enough to distract me from the feeling that I was being watched. I had been hiking alone in the wilderness before, and I knew it could sometimes make you feel paranoid, but this was different. This was something more. The air seemed heavier here, as if the woods themselves were watching, waiting. The trail eventually opened up into a more rugged part of the forest, with rocky slopes and narrow ridgelines. The way was steeper now, and the trail became more difficult to follow. I stopped for a moment to consult my map, checking the route to the waterfall. It was supposed to be just up ahead, but the trail was more obscure here, almost like it had been abandoned for some time. I didn't like the look of it, but I pressed on. I was determined to reach the waterfall before dark. I had heard that the sight of it at sunset was breathtaking, and I wasn't about to turn back now. The trail grew even thinner, and the trees began to close in around me. The sun was starting to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the path. I quickened my pace, eager to reach the waterfall before nightfall. But the further I went, the more isolated I felt. There was no noise at all now, no wind, no rustling, no distant animals. Just the sound of my own breathing and footsteps. Suddenly, the trail opened up in front of me. It led to a small clearing with a rocky ledge, and beyond that, I could see the glistening water of the waterfall below. It was more beautiful than I had imagined. The water cascaded down the rocks, creating a mist that shimmered in the fading light. The sight was peaceful, but I didn't feel peaceful. Something felt off. My unease from earlier had escalated, and I couldn't ignore the feeling that something, or someone, was nearby. I scanned the clearing, but there was no one in sight. The air was still. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. I stayed for a few minutes, taking in the view, but the discomfort grew unbearable. It was as though I was intruding on something, like I wasn't supposed to be here. I turned to leave, but as I did, I caught a glimpse of something in the trees across the clearing. A figure. It was standing still, partially obscured by the trees. It was difficult to make out in the fading light, but it looked like a person. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I froze. My heart began to race, and my breath caught in my chest. I tried to convince myself that it was just another hiker, but something about the way the figure stood, so still, so deliberate, made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't see their face. They were wearing dark clothes, blending in with the forest. But their presence was overwhelming. I knew I should leave, but I couldn't bring myself to move. My legs felt like lead. The figure remained motionless, just standing there. I had no idea how long they had been there, or if they had seen me. Then, without warning, the figure stepped back into the trees and disappeared from sight. I didn't wait to see where they went. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to get back to the trailhead as fast as I could. I didn't even take a moment to appreciate the waterfall anymore. I turned on my heel and began retracing my steps down the trail, my pace quickening. As I walked, my mind raced. Who had that been? Had they been watching me for a while? Was I imagining things? It didn't matter. I had to get out of there. The trail seemed longer on the way back, more confusing. The trees were more oppressive now, their shadows stretching out as the light dimmed. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figure following me. But no one appeared. Still, the feeling of being watched never left. When I finally reached the parking lot, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. I didn't care that I hadn't seen the sunset from the waterfall. I didn't care about the beautiful views. All I wanted was to be away from those woods. I reached my car and got inside, slamming the door behind me. As I pulled out of the parking lot, I glanced back at the trailhead, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw movement in the trees. But there was no one there. I didn't go hiking alone in that part of the woods again. I still don't know who or what I saw out there, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched in those silent woods. The woods that seemed to breathe with an intelligence I couldn't understand. The woods that weren't as empty as they first appeared.